Okay, welcome. And we are continuing our discussion of early modern philosophy today by moving on to a new philosopher, and to many of us, a very interesting philosopher and a very peculiar one in many ways. And that philosopher is Baruch Spinoza, or Bento Spinoza, or Benedict Spinoza, depending on which language and tradition you're saying Spinoza's first name in. We can just call him Spinoza. But Spinoza has a book called The Ethics. It's often considered Spinoza's masterwork. But not only is it a book on ethics, but it also covers big questions in epistemology and metaphysics. And that's mainly where we're going to be going today. So here's the plan. I want to lay out this idea called the principle of sufficient reason, identify some central definitions and axioms, and then look at Spinoza's argument for the view that there is only one substance and that substance has infinite attributes. Now, I pointed out that we're going to be thinking about central definitions and axioms. Well, this is important because of the peculiar way in which Spinoza proceeds. So whereas when we were looking at Descartes' Meditations, he was looking at it as sort of a conversation with himself. It almost had this dialogical form. For Spinoza's The Ethics, it almost looks like math on the page, because what he starts with is a series of definitions and axioms. So he's going to try to tell us exactly what he means by certain terms. He's going to give us axioms, and an axiom is basically a proposition that is a claim that's meant to be self-evident. That is, like, it's just obviously true when you think about it. And from these definitions and axioms, Spinoza is going to try to derive certain propositions from them. So, in a certain way, he's trying to run the entirety of metaphysics and eventually the ethics. So, like a way of looking at the world and living your life. He's going to do it as this rational, logical proof. Now, here's the next idea. This is not exactly the methodology as it's clearly laid out, but I would think of this along with some other more learned scholars of Spinoza, that we can understand Spinoza in an important way as being committed to what is sometimes called the principle of sufficient reason. Once you start to realize that Spinoza's work is what we might think of as a long-standing defense of the principle of sufficient reason, certain things might snap into focus a little bit more. So, what is this idea called the principle of sufficient reason? Sometimes you'll see philosophers abbreviating the principle of sufficient reason as the PSR. Well, one way to put it is that the principle of sufficient reason is the view that, in principle, every why question has an answer, right? So, for instance, we could answer the question, why is the sun shining today? Or we can answer the question, why is Goodine in Winston-Salem? Those would be questions with, they're questions that start with the word why, and we would say, like, there are answers, right? So we might say that the sun is shining today because of, the atmospheric pressure and the temperature and certain facts about the air humidity and maybe the nature of the sun and the atmosphere and so forth. We might answer the question about why I'm here in Winston-Salem with maybe a short explanation that I work from home on Mondays, or maybe a longer explanation of, how I got here in my life and how I developed certain routines, right? But you might say that not just those kinds of humdrum questions, but, why do I exist? Or why does science work? Or we might even say, why does the universe exist at all? Right? This is one of the big head scratchers in the history of philosophy, the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Right? Spinoza is going to say there's an answer to that question. I mentioned more learned scholars than I. We can look to Michael Della Rocca, who is an expert in early modern philosophy, who wrote a book on Spinoza. That is Spinoza, the book, in the Routledge Philosophers series, a great place to learn about different philosophers. But Della Rocca says, when we're talking about the principle of sufficient reason, this is the principle according to which each fact, that is, each thing that exists, right? So all the things that are existent are all the facts, perhaps, and we're going to say that all these facts have an explanation. And we're going to say that if every fact has an explanation, we're also going to say that that explanation, when we have a true explanation of the fact, it's going to be enough to enable to see why the fact holds, right? So we might say, for instance, that the fact that there are 2 dogs in my house right now is sufficient to enable one to see that there are at least 2 mammals, and once you count me, at least 3 mammals in the house, right? So we might say then that the principle of sufficient reason is going to say there are facts that are sufficient to explain everything that is true, right? So, for instance, not only do we see that the sun is shining today, but that fact has an explanation. And once we see the complete explanation of the fact that the sun is shining today, if it's a true explanation, then we'll see why it had to be the case that the sun is shining today. Just like the fact that there are some dogs in my house. Oh, one just jumped up on the sofa right now. So we might say that the fact that a dog jumped on the sofa is enough, and we might say like a guarantee sufficient to enable one to see that there's a mammal on the sofa. Now, we should also notice that the principle of sufficient reason for Spinoza should be understood in a metaphysical sense. So when we talk about a metaphysical sense, we're saying that this is a fact that in reality has some other facts that make it so, right? So the fact that the sun is shining is made so by certain facts about the weather, atmospheric pressure, and humidity. But we might also say that the PSR also has an epistemological aspect. So we're going to say that everything happens for a reason. So that's the metaphysical point. But we can also say that it's epistemological in that the answer to every why question can be made intelligible to us. So in this way, we can see that Spinoza is deeply committed to the idea of reason, that we have minds that are able to grasp the fundamental nature of reality and grasp the fact that nothing can happen for no reason, which is another way of saying that there is a reason that everything happens. So, yeah, there are no unexplained facts in the universe. In terms of metaphysics, and every fact that there is in the universe could in some sense be explained to us. I'll just flag a couple of places in the text where we can see Spinoza making claims that speak to this commitment to the PSR. He's going to say, for each individual existent thing, there must be a cause for its existence, right? So we might say, like, look, my dog exists. We might say, there must be an explanation for what causes him to exist. So I don't know, he's a street rescue, so we might say, well, he was born a puppy on the street as the result of two other dogs' activities. And we might also say that his continued existence is due to the fact that I feed and house this dog, right? So we would say, like, look, everything that exists has a cause for its existence. And he's just going to take this as far as he can. So he's going to say, not only does my dog have an explanation for its existence, but we can actually look at the explanation for why every dog exists in the universe. And we would then further say, the fact that there are this many dogs is perfectly explained by all the facts about how the world is. And that's why there's not more than that number, and also why there's not less than that number. So for each individual thing that exists, there is an explanation for why it exists, why it had to exist, which would also tell us why the facts of the matter about what exists are not different. Here's another claim that Spinoza makes. He says, that which cannot be conceived through another thing must be conceived through itself. There are many things in this world which are brought into existence, but we explain them in terms of other things. So, in the tradition of using things on my desk as props, here we have a mechanical pencil, and we might say that, well, this is a thing that came into existence and at some point will stop existing. And we might further go on to say, well, this was molded out of some plastic, assembled together, filled with lead, they put a spring in it, whatever else they do to make a mechanical pencil. And we might say that, in a sense, this particular object, this mechanical pencil, is a thing which has to be understood. We would say conceive it through another thing. So we would explain it through, conceive it through plastic in molds, and so on and so forth. Now he's also going to say that there are some things that are temporary beings, which are certain arrangements of the way that things are. There are other things that just exist in and of themselves. So one thing that we might say is, well, this is a certain arrangement of material reality, but material reality itself, now maybe some people might stop there. They might say, look, material reality is just a thing that is. Atoms come into certain arrangements and out of certain arrangements, but the things that are the atoms, those things are eternal, right? And we might say at some point, you don't understand the existence of atoms through, further things. You might just say, like, these are the parts. Now maybe with 21st century physics, now we're saying, like, look, we'd be thinking about subatomic particles, but the point still holds, right? We, at some point, just conceive the most basic subatomic particles through themselves, and you don't explain them in terms of something as like a substratum. Just, like the plastic was the stuff that makes up the pencil. That's how we understand it. Well, we don't understand subatomic particles in terms of the things that make those up. Subatomic particles just are, right? They just exist, and we don't understand them as composites of anything else. Now, this might be the distinction that we could make between substances and modes, right? A substance is a thing that is the most fundamental part of reality, and as we learned from Descartes, it's a thing that has independent existence. It's a thing that exists that doesn't depend on anything else, whereas a pencil, well, this is a certain mode or affectation of material substance, where we would say it depends upon, certain formations being put into certain kinds of material reality. right? But eventually, the idea is like we get down to ground level, we get down to this idea of substance. That's a thing that just is. And it's understood in terms of itself, not in terms of more basic constituent parts. But I've gone on for a bit. To zoom out, we should see that this is a way of thinking about the principle of sufficient reason, because it's a way of thinking about how everything could be understood at some level, and that understanding a thing is either getting down to the more basic level or seeing that a thing just is at the most basic level. And this further view that Spinoza has, that nothing happens for no reason. Or another way to put that is everything has an explanation. All right, so I said that Spinoza's method is he's just going to give us some definitions, he's going to give us some axioms, and then he's going to give us a proof of what reality is really like. So let's get some definitions on the board. One thing we might say is some things are finite, right? A finite thing can be limited by another thing of the same nature. So let's go back to the example of my mechanical pencil. Well, what is the nature of this mechanical pencil? Well, we might say it is a material thing. We could also say that this mechanical pencil is something that I could limit with other material things. So for instance, if I threw it on the floor, sometimes my dog will chew it up, right? It will get its teeth on there. He will get his teeth on there and put a bunch of bite marks into it. Or we could even go further and throw it into a wood chipper, right? And then it would stop being a mechanical pencil and it would just be some bits of plastic. Now, in this way, we might say that, look, this is a finite thing. Like, it might stop existing. That's one important thing to notice. But we might also point out that by definition 2, we might say that, well, a mechanical pencil is a material thing. And we can limit it, modify it, take it in and out of existence with other material things. We take it into existence with things like molds, and we take it out of existence with things like wood chippers or grinders. Now, I already got to this idea. Substance, right? Things are conceived through other things. So we might understand mechanical pencils in terms of materiality, but some things are just conceived through themselves, right? So just the general idea of, say, materiality. We also saw that for Descartes, he thought that, the mind is an independently existent thing. And insofar as that, you understand the mind in terms of the mind and thought. You don't understand it in terms of matter, right? Now, that's Descartes' view. We're eventually going to see that Spinoza has a different approach to substance. But we should see that Spinoza is thinking sort of in the same ballpark. Substances are things that are understood in their own terms, and that have their own independent of other things reality. Now, here's an interesting point. I've already familiarized you with this mode of thought in Descartes. Now we're going to have a special word for it when we get to Spinoza. And this is the word attribute. So we're going to say that things in the world have attributes. Now, in a certain way, we might just say that attributes are features of a thing, right? Now, when Spinoza is talking about an attribute, it's a little more specific than just a feature. It's a special kind of feature. And we're going to say that an attribute is that which the intellect can recognize as revealing the essence of a substance. So we actually saw this line of thought in Descartes when Descartes told us that the essence of mind is revealed through thinking. right? And he's also going to say, Descartes, that the essence of material things is extension, right? That it has width and height and depth, right? It's 3D-ness, it's taking up space, right? And the thought here is that these ways that a thing are reveal the essence of a thing. So another way to put this is that attributes are ways that things are that reveal a substance to be present to us. And that might make a certain amount of sense, right? Because if I am looking at a mechanical pencil, I am going to say, look, it's not just a thing for no reason, it's a thing for some reason, and then we're going to go on this line of thought that says, well, we're going to have to use a bit of physics, thinking about the nature of material beings, in order to talk about this particular one material being, right? So we say that the extension is an attribute that reveals there to be a substance in our presence, right? So we see extension, and that recognition of extension then indicates to us that there is a substance. So to put it this way, an attribute is a substance revealer. Okay? That's an important move that's going to get to Spinoza's eventual argument that there's only one substance. He also says, like, there are modes or affectations, that which is in something else, conceived through something else. So we might say that, like, pencilhood is conceived through materiality and shape and all these other more basic concepts. We might also notice that some modes, we might think of a mode as a temporary way of being, right? So in my case, sometimes I am asleep and sometimes I'm awake, right? We would say that those are in something else, right? There is me, I am a thing in a certain way. But to be asleep is dependent on my existence. To be awake is dependent on my existence. But sleepness and wakeness both come and go, right? I don't stop being me when I sleep. I don't stop being me when I become awake. These are just temporary modes or affectations of me. Spinoza comes right out and just defines what he means by God. So what are we talking about when we talk about God? Well, Spinoza says God is an absolutely infinite being with infinite attributes, each expressing eternal and infinite essence. Again, this is not terribly far from what Descartes taught us, or at least showed us he was assuming about the nature of God. Descartes is going to tell us that God is a necessarily existent being, a being that could not have failed to exist, and moreover, that God is an infinitely perfect being. Spinoza is also on board with this idea that God has an infinity of attributes, right? So we might say, does God have an attribute that reveals God to be a substance? And he would say, yeah. And ultimately, God will be a substance, that which is in itself and conceived through itself. Now, Spinoza does not, in his list of definitions, talk about essences, but I think that this is worth circling back to. Now, in our readings about Aquinas and the influence of Aristotle on Aquinas, they talk about essences there. Let's just recap what an essence is, though. Here's how I like to think about an essence. One way is to say an essence is a quality that is always there with a thing, no matter what, right? It could also be thought of as the definition of a thing, right? So we could say, like, the essence of a thing is the what it is to be-ness of something, or we could say that the essence of a thing is that which is completely tied up in a thing's nature, right? So, for instance, we can talk about keys. So here's a key in my hand. Now, we could say that for it to be a key, it has to be a thing with a certain shape and a certain weight, right? And we might say that these are essential properties of a key, because if it stopped having any shape or any weight, it would just stop being a key at all. You know, we might also say that the definition of a key is to have a certain kind of shape and materiality, such that it fits into keyholes and such that that it functions to open doors, right? But the idea is attributes are going to allow the perceiver to recognize that there is this indicator of a substance, right? It's basically sort of like a viewpoint that allows us to start thinking about the most basic part of reality. That stuff that we don't conceive through other things, but which is conceived through itself. So, we've gotten a bunch of definitions on the table at this point. Now, Spinoza gives us axioms. So you gotta stick with me through the definitions and axioms, and then we're gonna get a proof. That's how Spinoza proceeds. I'll try to move through these pretty quickly. First thing, all things exist in themselves or in something else. Now, we've already seen that idea when we start thinking about the difference between modes versus substances, or essences versus accidents, right? We might say some things are what they are, and that's just their nature. So we might say material reality could be a good candidate for it, or in something else, right? Material, particular items like mechanical pencils exist in something else, right? These exist as one way to arrange material reality. 2, if something cannot be conceived in another thing, it must be conceived through itself, right? So we would say that, like, pencils can be conceived through other things, but we might say that the ultimate nature of reality isn't explained through another thing. We just say that's the most basic starting point. That is our ground level of explanation. Now, we also saw this in my discussion of the principle of sufficient reason. All causes are necessarily followed by specific effects. So, no effects without a cause. So, this first point says, look, once you put certain causes into place, so if I, were to douse my desk with gasoline and then throw a lit match onto it, we might say, well, those are the causes, and assuming that there's enough oxygen in the room and no other impediments, we might say, like, the desk is going to be on fire if I throw gasoline and a match onto it, right? He also says no effects without a cause. So it's not like my desk would just light up in flames for no reason, right? So no effects without a cause. So this is another way of putting every effect has an explanation, or we might again say nothing happens for no reason. Here's a really interesting one. Spinoza says knowledge of an effect depends on knowledge of its cause. Now we might say here, for instance, that, well, I know that we have this effect, that the sun is shining today, but I would probably fail in certain ways to explain to you why the sun is shining. What are all the factors that went into there not being cloud cover in the sky? Well, to some extent, Spinoza would say, well, this would suggest that I don't really know, I don't fully know that the sun is shining. I just have this indistinct recognition of a feature, but I don't really know what fully explains it. Now, this might be a troubling thing, because we might say, like, we know all sorts of things without knowing their explanation. One thing that you might be interested to learn is that many of our advances in understanding the way that human genes behave did not emerge until well into the 20th century. So, for instance, it took a long time for scientists to understand that the main biological principle of sex differentiation was in this division within sperm of X and Y chromosomes. Right? So for centuries, babies were born, and the baby would be born and it would have either a penis or a vagina. But we would say, like, look, we know the effect, but for a long time we didn't know the cause. Not only just X or Y chromosomes, but then a longer, more complicated process of endocrine development and what's the word I'm looking for? Embryology, that explains how sex differentiation emerges. We didn't know how that worked for a long time. Now, maybe what Spinoza should say is that we didn't really know the effect. We didn't really know what we were talking about in terms of sex differentiation until we got an understanding of the underlying causal mechanisms. And in fact, we should also say, we don't fully understand all the science of sex differentiation in biology, nor do we have a great grasp on intersex individuals. Exactly what explains the fact that sex is not as simple of a binary as many people make it out to be. Now, maybe this is all to say, when we notice an effect, a baby is just born, and we say, we can obviously see the sex of the baby. We don't really know what we're talking about if we don't fully understand the underlying causal mechanisms. This might seem weird in some sense, because it seems like there are a lot of things that we observe and come to know without fully understanding their explanations. But I suppose in Spinoza's defense, we could say, he could still ask, do you really know what you're talking about? And he could further argue that this way of thinking is perhaps a plausible consequence of a commitment to the principle of sufficient reason. 5. Things with nothing in common cannot be understood through each other. Now, one thing that we might notice here is that certain features have nothing to do with other things. And we saw this in Descartes, right? Descartes told us that, well, thinking is one kind of thing, and materiality is another kind of thing. And to some extent, Spinoza would agree with this quite a bit. He would say, like, look, having a shape and a weight and a mass and a location is a feature of materiality, and being able to think, perceive, feel qualitative differences, well, that's a feature not of materiality but of thought. And we shouldn't try to, and we will fail to, explain the nature of thought when we think in mechanistic material terms. And maybe we'll fail to understand material reality when we think in terms of mental terms, right? So things with nothing in common cannot be understood through each other. He also says a true idea must agree with that which the idea is about. So this idea of having a true idea means that, look, concepts can't mean just anything, right? And to some extent, many people make it through the world with a false idea. So for instance, Aristotelians thought that water was a prime material. Like, there was no more basic building block of water. It was prime. But now that we know more science, we even know more science than Spinoza did, we now know that water is not a prime material like Aristotle and some of his followers thought. It's also not the thing that makes up everything in the universe. A pre-Socratic philosopher named Thales thought that. But we know that water is actually a composite molecule made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen ion. And we might say there that we have a more true idea of water than Thales or Aristotle, right? And we might say that we can refine our concepts and know what we're really talking about when we talk about these terms. And an idea is most true when we are grasping the essence of the thing through our mental representation of it. Now, this idea that true ideas represent things as they really are might help us to understand why the principle of sufficient reason is not only metaphysical, but it's also epistemological. That the explanation of everything could be made intelligible for us, just so long as we have true ideas. Last thing we'll say is, if a thing can be conceived as not existing, its essence does not involve existence. So I could conceive this pencil as not existing. Its essence does not involve existence. And we should say then that, well, it could come and could go. It is not an infinite or eternal being. Quite the contrary. It came into existence, it will go out of existence. So this gets us to a proof. Now here's the big idea. I've been giving you a lot of warm-up so far. Now we're going to see how Spinoza comes to think that there is only one thing, ultimately. So remember that attributes are something about a substance that reveals what it really is. So it is like a way of seeing a thing that allows us to recognize the substance that underlies it. Now, here's a point that Spinoza will take out of this, starting at proposition 5. If 2 things share an attribute, they must be the same substance. This should not seem that crazy to you. Because, for instance, if 2 things, this pencil and this block of wood, if this pencil and this block of wood both have the quality of extension, height, width, and depth, well, then they're both extended. And they must, for Descartes, he's going to say, like, look, these both share that substance revealing quality, so they must both be material, right? You couldn't have one with extension that reveals it to be a material thing and another thing with extension that revealed it to be an immaterial thing. No, they would have to have the same kind of substance if we recognize an attribute. After all, an attribute just is a feature that reveals the essence of the substance you're dealing with. Proposition 6. If one thing is the cause of another, they must share something in common. Remember how I said that this pencil was brought into existence by a mold? Well, we might say that there's something in common between the pencil and the mold that made it. After all, they're both material things. And we're going to say that no substance can be produced by something with different attributes. So you could not, for instance, make a material thing with an immaterial thing. Now, here's another point. All substances must be the cause of their own existence. This might start to make a little sense, right? You couldn't bring a substance into existence with something of a completely different nature. So it would have to be brought into existence by a thing of a similar nature. But eventually, those attributes in the final substance, that's our ground level explanation. And we're going to say these things are the cause of their own existence. Now, this line of thought also came through in Descartes already, and it's the idea of a being that could not help but exist. Now, we should notice that being self-sufficient in your existence, that itself is an attribute, right? We're going to say that self-sufficiency, being existent no matter what, well, that's a really good indication that you are the kind of thing that Spinoza was thinking about when he was thinking about that is that which is in itself, right? To be in yourself is to not be dependent on another being. Well, to be in yourself actually is a feature which the intellect will recognize as being the essence of a substance. Right? So what Spinoza is saying here is any substance is going to have this feature of being the cause of itself. Right? But we also already noticed that if two things share an attribute, they must be the same substance. Right? So now we have this idea that self-sufficiency, being self-caused, is an attribute. It would be an attribute of any substance, which means there's only one kind of substance, right? There is no attribute sharing between substances for Spinoza. So, on this view, anything that is an attribute will be an attribute of the single substance, and it's going to be infinite with infinite attributes. Now remember, when he talked about being finite, he talked about it as being limitable by another thing of the same nature. Well, a substance just is, right? And it cannot be brought into existence or taken out of existence by any other thing. That other thing would have to share some nature with it, right? So, substance at its ground level is not limited by anything else, and that's the way in which it's infinite. And any attribute will be an attribute of the same substance. So this gets us to Spinoza's proof that the single substance is infinite and it has infinite attributes. So Spinoza points out that if substance were finite, it would depend on some other being, but that would contradict the idea of substance being independent. That is, that which is in through itself. Attributes are all conceived through themselves. So for instance, materiality or thought. These are attributes which reveal substances. You think about those on their own terms. So you can think about them separately, but really what they are is different ways of revealing the necessarily existent being that underlies them. So as Spinoza puts it, there is nothing clearer than absolutely infinite being must necessarily be defined as consisting of an infinite number of attributes, each of which expresses a specific, eternal, and infinite essence. So, all the features, all the substance is not many things, but it's just for Spinoza one thing. Now, here's a question you might ask. You might say, hey, when I look out in the world, I don't see one thing, I see many things, recombining, mixing and matching. I can have a piece of paper and I can then rip it and we've divided it. Doesn't that mean there's many things rather than one thing? Well, Spinoza is going to go so far to say that even material reality is in fact infinite and it's also indivisible. So when I took this piece of paper and ripped it, well, I've rearranged certain aspects of the infinite material reality, but as soon as I rip paper and get the halves apart, air is jumping into the middle. So really, we've got this one big thing, indivisible, and it morphs and moves, but it's all still one big connected, as we might say, like blob of material reality. It doesn't have parts, right? When you take it to be finite and divisible, Spinoza thinks that you are thinking abstractly or superficially, right? So it's a superficial view to say that you can chop up and divide material reality, or for that matter, any infinite thing. But we're going to stop here. This has been maybe a bit of a weird ride in metaphysics, but an important and interesting one that is going to get us to this idea that for Spinoza, when we really think about what the nature of substance is, what the nature of attributes are, and why you only get to have one attribute per substance, or attributes are going to reveal the same kind of substance always. He's going to say that once we start thinking about what it is to be a substance, what it is to be an attribute, he's going to realize that there can only be a single infinite substance with infinite attributes. And that's how we explain the nature of reality, according to Spinoza. So, thanks for coming on this ride with me and listening in. In my next video, I'm going to talk about Spinoza's theory about the nature of God. So this is going to take us yet one step further on how Spinoza is giving us an interesting view, also one that's quite unique and unorthodox in the way that it looks. So, thanks for listening in. Be well. And if you have any questions or concerns, don't be shy to please reach out.